Welcome to another episode of Making Risk Flow. In today's episode, we sit down with Allison Hamilton, who leads U.S. customer success at Cytora, and we will explore what's really standing between commercial underwriting today and the new normal it could look like in, let's say, 3 to 5 years. Allison brings a rare vantage point because before Cytora, she spent years on the carrier side, working across product management, distribution, underwriting strategy, and building out the operational performance function that measured underwriting itself. That dual perspective, so having built a strategy carriers execute against, and now building the technology that helps them execute well, shapes everything we're going to talk about, from why underwriting performance is fundamentally a data discipline problem to why the hardest part of transformation isn't the target operating model, but getting frontline behavior to actually change. And we dig into where AI is overhyped and underhyped. And I'm really looking forward to Allison's view on this, and why trust and not technology or talent is the real barrier to carriers acting on automated recommendation, and what a carrier that's genuinely ahead of the curve will look like in 2030. So, Allison, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Juan. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with I mentioned a bit of your background in the introduction, but if you can provide an overview of what you've done so far in your current role, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Allison Hamilton. As you said, I run our customer success team here in the US. That's really our delivery team here in the US. So anytime a client, new or existing, is signing a deal with us, my team helps deploy and make that real. In terms of my background, you're exactly right. I've actually spent my entire career on the carrier side, P&C. I've been in a variety of roles, operation roles, distribution and underwriting strategy focus. My latest role was from product management. So it's kind of a big leap of faith, if you will, for me to kind of step outside the carrier walls and move into the insurtech side. But I'm really excited about it and excited to be leading the team that implements the technology that helps enable the strategies I've been helping carriers build for the last many years.
Let's start there. Let's start on your carrier background. What's the one thing that carrier experience has taught you?
Yeah. Well, it's taught me a lot of things, Juan, but I'll try to think of one or two maybe to share here. That would be helpful. I think the biggest thing that I've learned both from developing strategy, working in operations, and leading a product management team is you can have the perfect strategy, the perfect plan or target state that you are shooting for, but it is all about actually having that become real life and having that become real life for those who are the front line enabling and using that workflow. And that is the hardest piece to master. And I've seen that across multiple carriers. So I've yet to see someone perfect the wheel around that one.
So it is all about change management. Then it's about how do you deliver something that is usable. So is it more from a technology perspective, or how do you engage the end user? What's the angle there?
So I think a lot of times it is framed as change management. And change management, when I hear that term, is really about like behavior change, right? Like getting people to do something different. However, I actually think that's just kind of one element that needs to be considered. And what I've also seen maybe not line up with the new strategy that's trying to be implemented is having people have different incentives than they've had in the past. You know, oftentimes you may implement a new tech. Hopefully, you've also implemented a new workflow. But if you haven't thought about the incentives for people to actually change the behavior from what they're doing in the past, you still may not be successful despite all the best effort.
Is one. We often hear things like data, so trust on the data, right? At the end, any transformation you want to drive, it's based on the underlying data and the trust on that data. Do you see that also as a challenge?
Absolutely. That may be the biggest challenge in addition to the actual adoption of the changes you're looking to do. Data can be your best friend and it can also be your worst friend and be a complete nightmare to manage. A lot of times what carriers don't have a problem with is collecting lots of data. They have tons of information. But what they may have an issue or challenge with is they have built legacy systems and processes upon legacy systems and processes. And that data capture has never had a coherent structure or strategy. And so coming in to not only clean up the house as it stands, but set the house up to go in a better position moving forward can be really challenging. And that kind of gets to the incentives that I was talking about in the prior answer. So, for example, an underwriter has the way they know how to work, with whatever system or systems they're logging into on a daily basis. They know how to manipulate it. They may have some workarounds that help them get from point A to point B in the quickest manner possible. When it comes to solid data structure, accuracy, governance, workarounds can be the enemy to that goal. And so you really have to think about how are we setting up guardrails both within the system, but also that change in incentives and behaviors for the underwriter to naturally support data strategy and governance versus creating havoc within it.
So what are some of those incentives? Have you seen any? I think every time we think about incentives, everybody jumps into compensation, which might not be what you're referring to. But like, what type of incentives have you seen working well in the past?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of research out there talking about what compensation drives for incentives and what it doesn't. I think I'm talking more about how do you measure performance for the underwriter and how do they understand what meeting expectations looks like and exceeding expectations looks like. So fundamentally, in the past, if you just measured them on like number of quotes you did in a month, for example, and how many of those bound, that could be helpful. However, they may have been utilizing very poor data practices, very poor workarounds, things like that, that you don't want in your new target state system. So you have to think about how do I disincentivize that and perhaps shift the metrics to measure what I actually want them doing versus just speeding through quotes and trying to get as many out in a monthly basis.
The second point you made was about trust in the data. Now that you lead customer success at Cytora in the US, can you give us some examples of how do your teams build that trust on the data with clients deploying our platform?
My team is really, really skilled at this. I think number one, they want to meet the client where they're at, and they have patience to go on the journey with the client, how they want to go on it. So, some clients are quick to trust the performance of our models here at Cytora, and others want to trust but verify, right? And so maybe that means multiple rounds of testing, multiple iterations to really get to that optimal outcome. And so I think our team is really flexible on supporting the client on whatever pace and approach they think is appropriate to gain the trust within their own organization.
Allison, when you were talking about these multiple rounds of testing, it might come across as this is like a very lengthy process. So can you give us a sense of like how long does it take, or what you've seen takes clients or underwriters to really build that trust?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on our side, before we go live with any client, testing can actually be a pretty rapid process. You can do a round of testing and refinement within a matter of a couple days. So it doesn't have to take that long to go live. I think once you do go live and you've got end users in the system in production, that can be a slightly longer journey. A lot of times what I found is consistently sharing performance results with leadership and then having leadership cascade that down through their teams can be helpful. But at the end of the day, the underwriter needs to feel that what leadership is saying from a performance perspective is matching their experience on a day-to-day perspective. And so whenever you do get, an exception where an underwriter says, wait, this isn't right. Why did it come out this way? Diving into it, doing a full review and understanding, was this really an anomaly, or was this how the system should behave, or is there a tweak that's needed in the model, and taking that seriously and correcting it quickly can go a long way in building trust on a faster ramp up than otherwise stated.
And that's also why things like transparency of decisions or recommendations, we often talk about chain of thought, is so important, right? It's to provide the rationale of why the technology made the recommendation indeed, right, to the underwriter.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think a lot of AI in the insurance value chain workflow today does a good job of that, quite frankly. They may be ending up at what we think is the right answer, but we really have no idea how they got there. One thing that is great about the Cytora product, and we didn't share this, but I was also a client on the client side of Cytora before coming here. So I'm rather familiar with the product from that side as well, is there is a direct lineage visually within UIs that help us understand how the model came up with the answer that it did. So anytime that needs to be verified on the client side, whether it's for testing or actually in a production go live setting, I think that can be extremely helpful in supporting that trust ramp and, really believing like, yes, this AI is helping us do things faster and better, but most importantly, it's helping us do it accurately.
Yeah. I mean, we see that has a huge impact, not just from the generating that trust in the underwriters, but also from a regulatory perspective, right? You need to have traceability of why the platform made the decisions it made, as you were describing just now. Thinking about the future of commercial underwriting and what it might look like.
I'm not sure if this is a disappointing or exciting answer, but a lot of what we're talking about, the potential of AI, should be realized by then. And what I mean by that is an underwriter's day to day should look fundamentally very different than how most commercial underwriters are spending their time today. So, what does that mean? They are no longer receiving an email for a submission and having to review it before sending it off for kind of centralized processing and intake. Instead, they're going to just be receiving an output from the workflow up front of the underwriter, where it is a fully assembled submission. It has been enriched with data that was supplementary to the actual submission received, and even a recommended action for the underwriter to consider or next steps to take should be clearly outlined and visible for the underwriter. So the underwriter is fundamentally shifting from data assembly and retyping of data into really thinking purely about pricing nuances, exceptions, and then broker relationship management outside of the transaction itself.
Part of that is obviously is real today, right? Is the enrichment of data, for example, so the digitization of a submission, enrichment of data. There are some parts which sometimes we forget, right? Which is like you receive a submission from a broker, it's digitized and enriched, it gets to an underwriter, but still is missing data, right? So the underwriter, it's almost like we've automated part of the process, but then there's still that manual back and forth that almost kind of negates or like does not enable the vision that you described of the underwriter starting from a decision-ready risk. So how do you see that part of the workflow also changing?
I think what I've described is probably something that's more real today in the small end of commercial and obviously in personal lines at this point. But when you get into your mid-large specialty risks, as much as we want to make a standard common workflow and make the process as common as possible, we have to acknowledge that there's a reason these are mid-large specialty complex risks, and each of them have specific nuances and components to them that right now only the human underwriter has the kind of judgment to ask the right questions, get the information needed to make the final decision on pricing and terms. That over time should start to lessen in terms of all risks have to be reviewed by the underwriter to closing the funnel up, right? Of like what actually needs to go in front of the underwriter for those pricing nuances, exceptions, et cetera. So, I think we're on a journey towards it, but I don't know if we're fully there yet.
Let's jump straight into the question I really want to ask you, which is, having seen this reality from both sides, what would you say is overhyped from an AI perspective and underhyped from an AI perspective?
In the mid-large specialty space, I do not believe that any carrier has achieved full automation where an underwriter or anyone else is not involved in the full end-to-end submission to bind. I think everyone is at parts along that journey, but no one's fully realized it yet. So there's so much talk about that full automation workflow. And again, I think many are on the path to it, but have not fully realized it yet.
What would you say is underhyped?
Well, what they have done up until this point is, some of the less glamorous parts, and it's really in that get the submission ready for underwriting portion of the workflow. So submission intake, triage, data assembly. I think AI is having a big impact in that space. And those that have restructured their actual total workflow and also have set up those incentives for people to participate in the right ways in that workflow are probably actually seeing bottom line savings today in the kind of front end part of the value chain.
Okay, so if we take all of these together, would you say in the more homogeneous segment of the market, either because they're small risk or because they are special to risk but more homogeneous, is that where you would see a target state in a few years where it starts becoming fully automated? And perhaps it's not 100% there yet, but would you agree with that? Or would you not even see the full automation even in the more, because I think we see this in pretty much every client, right? Even for the more complex clients, there's always a percentage of risks that are, call it simpler or more homogeneous, that there's always an ambition to try to drive automation end to end, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you're exactly classifying it correctly. I think one of the learnings that carriers go through on this journey of adopting automation and adopting AI is prior to AI, the whole play was lower your costs, drive efficiency. And so a lot of portions of the value chain workflow were moved to the lowest cost models, sometimes offshore models, sometimes third-party partners, et cetera. Now that we're bringing AI into the mix and we're automating, to your point, the homogeneous, the simple, the easy parts of the task, what we're actually finding is that efficiency play or that low-cost model play is not working perfectly with having the highest complexity, tougher transactions fall out that need human intervention. And so what used to be, standard 100 widgets a day, 95 of them look the same, and I can offshore that for a low cost provider, is now those 5 are probably falling out to that low cost provider, and they may not be equipped to handle or make the decisions related to those remaining transactions.
When we talk about end-to-end automation, quite often the first thing that comes to mind is efficiency, right? Can you automate? I've heard you many times talk about, well, efficiency is fantastic, but there's such a, so the real prize is in broker service. And then you've got some interesting stats based on your experience on how does an accelerated quote turnaround time, how does it impact growth?
I think the secret is out on some of these metrics at this point in the industry. There are probably some first movers in this space, but essentially the bottom line is faster wins. We know it's incredibly consequential in the wholesale market, but it's also extremely significant in the retail market. There are lines of businesses that if you are first to quote, and you can have pretty broad range in the pricing and the terms and the conditions you put out there, but if you're first to quote, you have a 50% greater chance of binding. And that is dramatic when you think about the number of carriers that may be quoting on a risk and how competitive that risk may be for any one carrier to actually win it. So, you have to understand the segment of the market that you're trying to play to and what are the drivers to help the broker, producer, agent solve for that specific transaction type. And sometimes it isn't lowest price. Sometimes it's fastest quote.
So building on that point, Allison, you made about speed, right? And thinking about the end-to-end workflow. How do you think about the fragmentation of the US market and its implications on the technology required and how it gets built?
Yeah, this is one of the most challenging, I think, dynamics that any solution, whether it's in-house built or third-party built, needs to face, which is as much as we want to standardize and make common, once you move out of the small commercial space, you are moving into a spider web of regulations, pricing specifics, appetite nuances, regional differences, competitors and lines of business competing for the same business. And really, what that all comes down to is your solution needs to be highly flexible, dynamic, configurable for that specific client. Every carrier is looking at a lot of data and they come up with different strategies that shift not just annually, but multiple times within the year around the type of business they want to target, the type of pricing they want to offer out in the market, the types of terms and conditions they want to put out there on the market. And so a one size fits all solution is really not the play for this segment of the market. So yeah, it can be really challenging because although you've maybe worked with dozens of clients in the past, it doesn't mean the next one's going to be the same as the prior 2 dozen that you've worked with and interacted with.
That has implications from the configurability of whatever technology you're using to the view of risk, data requirements of each carrier, but also the ability of evolve it in real time, right? You said it like sometimes you want to evolve your appetite or what data you're capturing on a monthly basis, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think take the California wildfires that hit LA and that area in the past. That event, which didn't go on for too long of an actual time period, fundamentally shifted the insurance market across multiple lines of business. There were insurers looking to run for the exits from the market, but then there were also opportunistic insurers looking all of a sudden to come into the market and seize the opportunity that the wildfires presented. So although it was a tragic event, it required insurance carriers to pivot very quickly and their broker partners to pivot very quickly to the changed market dynamics.
Technology so how carriers are thinking about technology, specifically in commercial lines. What do you think is most exciting? I guess two sides of the question. What's most exciting coming in this space? And also, what do you hear? And now that you work with many brokers and carriers, what do you hear in terms of what's going to be some of the next big things?
Let's start with the carrier side. So the carrier side, I think some carriers are making really good headway down this, but I think many still are early in their journey. And that's around third-party data enrichment. So you receive your submission, could be for new business. It could also be information for a renewal. And it is inherently going to be missing some information that's required to make final underwriting decisions, if not even earlier decisions in the intake process. The carriers that are going to win are those that are going to leverage third-party data to enrich their submissions so they can make decisions faster versus waiting to hear back from the broker or the producer with the information they could provide direct from the insured. This can be very technical and complex to deploy because again, it's a nuanced decision, right? Like what information do I need based on the attributes of the risk that I have in front of me? And so it's not always a standard list of like data enrichment partners that you have to consider. And that's where we start to make progress on where is the underwriter involved versus where can AI really help move the needle on enrichment. So I would say that's kind of from the carrier side.
And just to touch on that one, Allison, because I think probably historically, people would have thought of external data enrichment as just collecting more data about the risk and can you do more nuanced risk selection, which is totally fair. But I think if I link this back to your point about the speed of getting back to the broker, how does external enrichment allow you to get back to the broker faster? Does it play a role there?
If you have to go through a manual back and forth email process or even a phone call process to gather additional information, it's going to take you days, if not longer, to get out a quote. Even if you have fast internal automation, if you leave that portion out, it's a long process. Those that are able to enrich the submission with third-party data and feel confident in the accuracy of that third-party data to make decisions upon it, those are the ones that are going to be getting those quotes out on brokers' desks faster and have a much higher likelihood of binding.
That makes a lot of sense. Sorry, I interrupted you. I think you were shifting gears to the agency side, I believe.
Yeah. So this has been the age-old challenge when working with the distribution or the broker or agency producer side of the insurance value chain, which is despite significant M&A activity over the last decade plus, there are still thousands and thousands of players out in the US market. And each one of them has their own processes and approaches, and carriers have to figure out how to work with each of them and do it at scale. So, I think when I really consider what's going to win in that space with brokers and agents, it's going to be carriers that can meet the agent where they're at. And traditionally, the answer to that has been come log into our portal and interact with us here. There is no question, there's been plenty of feedback on portals up until this point. Brokers don't want to log into 15 portals to get quotes and to follow up on missing information, et cetera. They would much rather a process where the carrier can directly plug into their systems and their workflow and exchange information versus having to go to multiple other screens to complete the quote and bind process. And I think carriers that figure out how to solve that challenge are the ones that are going to have significant opportunity, because not only will their brokers enjoy working with them, but they'll be much easier to work with. And therefore, the opportunity to shift business to those carriers that have figured out is significant.
I think historically that this was probably perceived as well, Mr. Broker, here you've got a portal to log in. And I think what probably we're hearing from agencies and brokers is, well, that is not, to your point, that is not good enough. It's like, why wouldn't you, Mr. Carrier, provide a quote directly in the broker management system I use on a daily basis?
Absolutely. And I think, the carrier side as well, that's really the holy grail for them as well, right? Like it would be much easier to remove these these kind of middle parts and portals that need to be interacted with and just have information flow freely, almost as if it's within the four walls of the organization itself.
Let's bring all these together. You've talked about technology, change management. You've talked about where the industry is going. So if you think about, let's fast forward to 2030. What would it look like a successful winning carrier at that point of time?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if I was to bring together some of the ideas we've talked about, it's not going to be one thing, right? It's going to be multivariable that a carrier has to execute on well. So the first piece would be collapsing the time it takes for a submission to arrive at the carrier and then be ready for underwriting decisioning. As we mentioned, some have done relatively well in this space thus far. Others are still working on multi-day processes. The winners are going to be down to minutes on that. And that's going to be through a variety of techniques like we talked about, like third-party data enrichment, web grounding, things of that nature. But then the second thing is those risks need to be underwriter decision ready with recommended actions for the underwriter to take. So essentially, the underwriter is only spending their time on judgment calls rather than any form of manual data entry or data assembly to make it decision ready. And then we don't want to lose sight of the point you raised earlier, Juan, which is we need any decisions or actions taken by automation or automation solutions to be traceable and understood. And today, I think we're in early days of that, but by 2030, we should be able to understand every decision that the AI is making as much as we understand the decisions that the underwriter is making and documenting as well.
And what would be the relationship with the brokers at that stage?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, if you're having that true end-to-end integration, so, back up from the submission and the actual risk being put together, assembled by the broker, and then submitted over to carriers, Those that have figured out that end-to-end workflow will be the winners. And what they should be seeing is significant portions of books transferring hands. And perhaps that would be both in new business opportunities, but I think even more opportunistic are renewal opportunities. If you can make the renewal seamless and easy for an agent to actually shop it and not cause a significant amount of rework, there would be high incentives for a broker to want to shop renewals at a much higher rate than they do today.
And I know we've been talking about the 2030, which always feels like a long time away, which is not. But I think we're seeing some of this transition already, right? So we hear from agencies and brokers, they are looking at consolidating their books with preferred partners. And a common theme we hear there is they want to consolidate it with partners that are easiest to work with. Which I think that those two things that you mentioned, which is faster turnaround time, capacity, underwriting capacity, focus on judgment, really is what drives that kind of easier to work with.
And no bespoke portals that they have to go and interact with in between.
So to wrap it up, you've recently joined us, and we cannot be more excited to have you with us. And I know you're very demanding of others and of yourself. How are you going to judge your own success? I don't know, say in 6 to 12 months in your current role.
Yeah, that's a super fair question. My success should start and end with the client. If our clients are realizing the visions and the objectives that they've set out to accomplish with us as a partner for them, I've done my job really well. It really is not much different on the carrier side, especially as I worked in my product management space. At the end of the day, it's the end user, it's the client, it's the customer that should judge your success. And everything else is just kind of noise or part of the process to get to the outcome that you're seeking. Benefit and value realization is needed. It's real, but it's also elusive. And it's really important that whether you're working with Cytora or any other solution, that you actually can tangibly understand the benefits that solution has driven into your workflow and into your organization. And that's, at the end of the day, what my team's responsible for and how we should be judged.
That's a great way to wrap up the episode. It's all about the client success and business impact. A huge thanks to you, Allison, for joining me and being so generous to share with us kind of your view from both sides of the desk, from the carrier and from Cytora. I think if there's one thing for me to take away, I think it's that the future of underwriting is less about replacing judgment, and it's about really clearing away everything that gets in the way, right? That you mentioned about the reeking of data, the triage, the manual research, that basically eats the underwriter's day before they even get to decisioning a risk. And I think the other takeaway I'll take from this conversation is that the real barrier to the future that you described by 2030, it's not the technology or even the talent. It's that trust that needs to be earned through transparency and track record over time. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, Allison.
Thanks, Juan.